What's good everyone, Evan Jarvis here, and today we are going to do a tier ranking video for Heroes of Hold'em. In today's tier ranking video, we are going to be ranking the Cleric abilities from S tier to D tier. And for some context, this is mainly going to be for reg-filled tournaments where you're competing against other regulars, not purely the tournaments like the 1-man and 2-man sit and goes where you're playing mostly against NPCs. However, I will speak to the abilities that benefit even more in that particular format of gameplay. In terms of my qualifications, I finished in the top 10 on the season leaderboard before, despite playing a much lighter schedule than the other people who finished above me. I've final tabled the huge field zombie horde multiple times, and I've also scored plenty of first place finishes in lineups with the toughest players in the game, the highest ranked players on the leaderboard. So with that out of the way, let's get right into the fun of ranking the Cleric's best abilities and the worst abilities as well. And hopefully this information will help you build a better Cleric, get more caches, and ultimately get more wins. So we're going to be going through things in alphabetical order and then just ranking them as we see fit. First thing we have is Angelic Ally. If you have 5 or fewer minions at the start of the event, create an additional angel minion under your control. For me, this is probably going to go into the B tier category. I use this one only if I'm doing a minion-based build, and the minion-based builds tend to excel more in the 2-man, maybe the 4-man where you have some newer characters playing. And a lot of NPCs. I don't find that the minion builds do as well when you're playing in a fully reg-filled tournament. So for me, it's a great ability if you want to get that extra minion and if you want to do a 5 or 6 minion build, but it's not one of the top tier skills that I'm going to go to when I know I'm playing against tougher competition. Next, we have Answered Prayers, which for me is definitely S tier. Answered Prayers reactivates one targeted exhausted ability, which means it brings back one of your other abilities and you choose which ability that is. Getting back abilities is one of the most valuable things in Heroes of Hold'em, and getting to choose specifically which ability you get back makes it even more powerful. So the fact that Answered Prayers lets me get back the ability that's going to benefit me most in the current situation that I'm in, it's definitely an S tier ability and one that I have on pretty much all my builds. Next, we have Avoid Traps, which is a prevention effect. Cancel the effect of any trap that you trigger. I have to be honest, I've pretty much never used this, so it's going to go in D tier. I think it would work against Ranger, as that's the one class that uses traps, but otherwise I don't really see any utility in it, so I don't play this ability at all. Next we have Bestow. Target opponent gets the button at the start of the next hand. Until you have the button, any pots they win, you receive an equal amount of health. And this one I'm going to put in A tier. It's something that's pretty underrated, and I didn't notice at first because it was just a rare ability as opposed to an epic or legendary. But from playing against a lot of clerics and watching them use this in game, I realized that this is an extremely powerful ability, especially late game when you can cast it on the player to your left. So you get 5 full hands before the button comes back around to you. You get 100% of the pots that they win. Like you get to match the gains that they get. So if you throw this on a big stack and they happen to play a big pot, you can free roll a chance at a massive pot. If you throw this on an NPC that you know is just going to wildly play big pots, you're basically free rolling the chance at winning insanely large pots on the times that they're lucky and losing nothing on the times that they lose those pots. So really powerful. And if you get lucky enough to have one of your own minions on your left that you can cast this on, then you can just go all in against that minion, and it's a massive free roll. If you bust the minion, you double up, and if the minion doubles through you, you get the same double up because you get the pot size that they win. So this one's A tier for me, almost S tier. I think the only thing that keeps it from being S tier is that if you're casting it on anyone other than the player on your direct left, it only lasts for, you know, a few hands as opposed to the full 5, which still isn't a ton. So next up we have Bless. Minions you control gain 40% of your health pool. And this one is also going to be a B tier ability in my books. Most of the B tier abilities are probably going to end up being minion build abilities, because if I'm playing in a 2-man sit and go, a minion based build is often going to crush it and just kind of help me cruise to heads up where I'm going to cash and you know, get some hero token and some rank, but it's not going to compete in the toughest of fields. So I think that the minion based build abilities definitely are going to belong in the B tier category. They're better than the ones that C and D mostly aren't going to use, and they just don't really touch on what S tier and A tier have to offer. So Bless, the way I like to use it is generally, if I'm doing a minion based build, I buff up my minions with some other abilities we'll talk about, and then once they've won a few pots and my health has gone up, you know, 100%, 200%, 400%, that's when I'm going to look to cast Bless. I want to basically give my shortest stack minions at least a double up or more, and if I'm not doubling them up with Bless, then I'm going to wait until I have a higher health amount to cast Bless. So that's kind of how I play it. And occasionally, if I'm just going really hard on beefing up my minions, I may cast Bless at that point and then use Answered Prayers to get it back. If my chip stack has grown, you know, 2x second place and the leech has really worked out, then I'll cast Bless again and beef my minions so that we might be, you know, top 6 players in the whole tournament. So pretty powerful when used effectively, but very situational. Next, we have Charm, which is gain control of target non-dragon minion with less health than you for the remainder of the event. And again, this is going to go under B tier. This is very much for a minion-based build. I had some debates with the dev whether it's better to buff the minions yourself or to steal them from other people. And Charm is great because you can steal a minion after its overlord has buffed it up. Or you can save this till late in an event and steal one of the strongest minions remaining if they happen to not be a dragon. The downside to Charm is that if all the minions get eliminated, which they often do because they're pretty bad poker players, you end up with a wasted ability slot because you can't use Charm if there's nothing to charm. Also, if you already have 6 minions, you can't charm a 7th, but if you lose one of your minions, you can kind of use Charm as higher level revive. So it's got some benefits there. Next up, we have Cure Ailments, which is remove all debuffs attached to you and apply them to the players to your left and your right. This is going to be an A tier ability for me. Having the abilities to cleanse debuffs is extremely important when you're playing against other strong players. People are going to be hexing you, poisoning you, casting bleeding on you, casting dispel evil on you, silence, all these things that are going to inhibit your ability to play the game effectively without your abilities. And so having something that cleanses those debuffs is absolutely essential to a solid build. The other benefit to Cure Ailments is not only do you get rid of the debuffs on yourself, you also put them on the players to your left and your right. So, you know, you can go from being hexed to hexing other people or from being poisoned to poisoning other people. So it's got an extra perk in it that, you know, makes it pretty close to S tier, but just not quite there in my books. Okay, next up we have Decompose. Opposing minions at your table take 20% of their health pool and damage. You gain 50% of that health. And for me, this is D tier. It's first, you need to be in a situation where you're at a table that have a bunch of minions. Then you need those minions to have high health pools. And then even still, you basically only get 10% of the health that you take away from them. So it's something that doesn't really damage the opponents that much, doesn't really get you that much health, and is something that I pretty much never equip to any of my clerics. Next, we have Dispel Evil. Speaking of debuffs, prevent all opponents at the table from playing abilities for the next 6 hands. If they are a necromancer, extend this to 9 hands. And this one's going to be S tier for me. It is the most powerful debuff that a cleric has. And there was a period before the most recent patch where the only way to cleanse this was an antidote potion. Because Dispel Evil made it such that you couldn't use abilities, people couldn't use their cleanse debuff abilities. Now the devs felt that that was a little bit broken and it made the cleric a little bit too OP. So they changed it where the one type of ability you can use when Dispel Evil has been cast on you is the ability to cleanse debuffs. But I still put it in S tier because if you're playing against someone who maybe didn't realize they needed something that can cleanse their debuffs, you can completely handicap them for, you know, an orbit, or if you add some studded equipment, an even longer period of time where they really just can't do anything. They can't use their heals, they can't use their counters, they really just can't do anything other than make sure that they win when it comes to the poker side of things, which leads to them typically playing a lot more passively and enabling you to get a lot more pots. So very powerful spell here, Dispel Evil. Although it can be cleansed with debuffs, it's still a really powerful one to have. And depending on who I think is going to be in the lineup, I'll sometimes equip it, sometimes not. Okay, next we have Divine Reclamation, one of the newer abilities in game. Steal any sheltering buffs, whatever duration is left, add an additional 2 hands and double the healing bonus. For me, this one's going to be an A tier, borderline S tier. I could see maybe with the new patch swapping Dispel Evil and Divine Reclamation. The one thing about Divine Reclamation that I think keeps it from being S tier is the fact that you need a specific situation to come up to use it, and that is that someone else is sheltering. It's extremely powerful when someone else is sheltering, because not only do you steal the shelter, not only do you double the healing buff to gain 10% of your 10% of average health per hand, as opposed to just 5% of average health per hand. And the most beneficial thing is that you take the shelter away from the other person who probably needed it. If someone hopped into shelter, whether it's from using sleep potion or one of their abilities, they probably really wanted to sit out those blinds and get their heal on. And when you can just take that away from them, you put them in a very tough position. The other reason Divine Reclamation is one of the best shelter stealing abilities is the fact that you can use it pre-flop. So all you have to do is, limp into a pot, and then you can cast it and take someone else's shelter and really throw a wrench in the works for them. When I'm playing the Horde and I want to survive as long as possible, and I assume that other players are also going to be using their shelter spells, I really like to throw Divine Reclamation on my build, because it effectively gives me a second, or in my case, third shelter, because I use Lost in Prayer, which we will talk about. And I also use Sleep Potion. Next we have Eye for an Eye. Reveal target opponents and your own hole cards for the duration of the hand. This one I put in D tier because, seeing your opponent's hole cards is very powerful, but if they can see your hole cards too, how useful is that really? Generally the best hand's just gonna win. You can't do any bluffing, and I don't really see the benefit in giving your opponent additional information, even if it's giving you some information. So if I have no other abilities available, and this is, what I've drawn from a chest, sure, I'll use Eye for an Eye, but I can't really think of too many situations in which it's going to be all that useful, to be honest. Okay, next up we have Hallowed Halls, which is one of my absolute favorite abilities in the game. For the next 12 hands, you and your minions win an additional 50% health from pots 1. Immediate S tier ability. First off, the 50% health from pots 1 is massive. You win a 2k pot, you get an additional 1k on top. You win a 20k pot, you get an additional 10k on top. You win a 5 million chip pot, you get an additional 2.5 million chips on top of it. The amount of chips and health that can be generated from this spell is absolutely off the charts. And it's not just your hero who gets this benefit, all your minions get this benefit as well. So for example, I have a minion-based Cleric where my angels have 50% leech. Well, now I'm getting half of the health that they won from those pots, but they're getting it all back through Hallowed Halls as well. So despite the fact I'm leeching 50% of their health, they're still chipping up significantly with Hallowed Halls being in play. I also really love the fact that Hallowed Halls works really well in the early game to help you get a good start, and it is pretty much OP in the end game when the blinds are so massive that being able to generate extra chips out of the ether is just unbelievably beneficial. Finally, the fact that it lasts 12 hands, where most abilities last 6, maybe 9. Really nice to get that extra time. So one of my favorite abilities in the game, I pretty much always limp into the first pot so that I can cast Hallowed Halls if I'm playing a minion based build, because I want my minions to get that extra health bonus. If however I'm playing without really focusing on minions, I'll save this for the first big pot that I know I'm going to play and cast it on flop when I expect that I'm probably going to win the pot, because I like that pot to be an additional 50% bigger than it's going to be anyway. So extremely powerful ability, kind of a must have on any Cleric build. Next we have Heal the Congregation. All minions you control gain 40% of average health pools. And this one's similar to Bless, but in my opinion, not quite as good. So I'm going to throw this one in C tier. If I was going a pure minion based build, then I like having Bless and Heal the Congregation together. The reason that I rank Heal the Congregation lower than Bless is that I find early game, they tend to be similar in terms of what that 40% benefit is. 40% of average health, usually going to be similar to 40% of your health pool, maybe a little bit higher, but I find it doesn't scale as fast. With Bless, if I win a couple pots early, or my minions win a couple pots early and I've got a bigger stack, now that 40% healing is huge. Whereas average stack kind of grinds along and slowly gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I feel that unless I'm extremely short stacked, in which case I have bigger problems to deal with, Bless is almost always going to be for more chips than Heal the Congregation. So that's why it's a B tier and Heal the Congregation is a C tier. Now, if you're going pure minion based build, then having both of these is fine. And I would cast Heal the Congregation first and then Bless a little bit later. But yeah, I would only use it on a pure minion based build, and only would I equip Heal the Congregation if I was doing it in conjunction with Bless, never instead of it. Okay, next we have Holy Goblin Sapper. End of hand, Goblin explodes, dealing 50% of your health pool to all opposing minions at the table. Winning hand heals all minions you control for 50% of your health pool each. Not a bad secondary effect, but I'm still probably gonna throw Holy Goblin Sapper into D tier. Firstly, we're only targeting the minions at the table. We're not gonna be in too many situations where the table is extremely minion filled. Granted, if it is, 50% damage, not too shabby. And then winning the hand heals all minions you control for 50% of your health pool. Again, the fact is you have to win the pot, and then you need your minions to still be alive. It is a nice heal getting that extra 50%, but I'd rather just cast Bless and get the 40% guarantee to not have to win the pot. So maybe it's C tier. We'll see by the end of the video if I change my mind on that, but it's definitely going to be in the lower echelons here. Next up, we have Holy Shield. Regain 100% of health lost in a hand after losing a showdown. Immediate S tier. This is a healing spell. Pretty much all the healing spells you'll see in my videos of doing the tier lists, that the healing spells make it to the top tier. And Holy Shield is one of the very best. Because you get 100% of the health you lost back in hand. Other classes, you might get 60, you might get 35. 100% is massive because it basically lets you play a huge pot and know that worst case, if you lose that pot, you just get all your health back. It's really good to have in the end game. It's really good when you're, going for the KO at the end of a tournament. And it's also really good for survival mid game. So Holy Shield, absolute must if you're playing Cleric. Use it strategically, never waste it on small pots. Always try to wait for what you believe will be the biggest pot you're playing for a while. And if you happen to lose it, use it then, because you want your healing to be as much as possible. Also, it's brittle, you can't get it back. So, use it when you absolutely need to, rather than just because you want to. But definitely S tier, definite must have. Inquisition. Opponents choose to either put 20% of their health into the pot or reveal both of their whole cards. I think this one we can go in C tier. Again, it's not one that I use often, but it is one that seems kind of interesting, that against some bigger stacks, you can force them to lose 20% of their health or show their cards. It gives you a lot of information that only you have access to. And if not, it does some damage. So decent spell. We'll put it in C tier. Next up, we have Lost in Prayer. Shelter for 5 hands or 3 at the final table. Cannot be used when heads up and is brittle. It's going to be an A tier ability in my books. I think that Shelter is an extremely powerful ability in Heroes of Hold'em. It's really useful when you're on the bubble of a big field tournament where, blinds are going up, a lot of players are getting forced all in. That if you can just survive a few more hands, you're going to make it into the money, you're going to get your rank up, you're going to get those hero tokens. And Shelter allows you to do that. You get to sit out for 5 hands. Not only do you not have to post blinds, you get to heal for 5% of the average health pool every single hand that you're sitting out. And often you can sneak into the money just by casting this spell. So sheltering for me is pretty much always going to be A tier, regardless of the length. And 5 hands is a pretty good length compared to some of the other classes and their shelter abilities. This can also be beneficial if you get to the final table of a big field event, or even final table of a smaller field event where, say, 4 spots are paid and 5 spots are left. If blinds are getting really big, maybe you're playing the Flip for Your Life event where average stack is like 3 big blinds. Well, not having to pay the small blind and the big blind can really save you and can give you a much better chance of getting in the money. So having this spell, very beneficial. You just have to know when to cast it. You don't want to cast it if you're, say, under the gun on a 6-handed table, because then you're only going to skip the big blind. You want to make sure that of those 3 hands you're going to skip, one is when you're in the small blind, and one is when you're in the big blind if you want to get the most value out of a shelter spell like Lost in Prayer when you're using it on the final table. Okay, next up we have Purgatory. If no player is all in, pay 10% of the current pot into pot. The hand ends immediately without showdown. The entire pot is added to the starting pot of the next hand. I'm going to throw this one in C tier. It's another one that I don't really use pretty much ever, but it does have some interesting things working for it. You know, if you're playing a decent sized pot, but it's not an all-in pot and it looks like you're probably going to lose it, well, you can end the pot immediately by paying 10%, which is going to be pretty cheap relative to the size of the pot, and then move it to the next hand. The only like downside about this is you really don't know what's going to happen on the next hand, and there's no way you can know that you're going to have a lock for the next hand. So again, I see this needing a lot of specific things to go in your favor for it to work out, but it feels like it can be a spell that, you know, you could use to avoid, you know, almost getting stacked and maybe delaying it one more hand. But again, because of how much luck is involved, I'm going to throw it in the C tier category. Next, we have Ray of Light. 1 random hole card from each opponent becomes visible to the caster only for 3 hands. This one I'll throw in C tier. It's like an eye for an eye, except we get information and we don't have to give away any information. So because it is a one-sided informational advantage gambit that benefits the caster, I think it definitely goes in C tier rather than D tier. Obviously, seeing 1 hole card is nowhere near as good as seeing 2, but it's better than seeing nothing. And you get to cast it pre-flop, which, you know, gives you information you can use for the rest of the hand. Okay, next we have Resurrection. When the first minion you control is eliminated, revive it with 75% of average health pool automatically. Brittle. This one I'm going to throw in the B tier category. It's also a minion-based spell, but the thing about Resurrection is it's not really used in a minion-based build. If you're doing a minion-based build, you're typically going to have lower point minions, whether it's liches or angels or gorgons, something like that, rather than the high cost red dragon, emerald dragon, diamond dragon. So with Resurrect, you would want to have a very strong minion to revive rather than a weak minion to revive. Your weak minions are going to die off much more quickly, and you don't really want to revive a character or a minion early in the game where they're not going to have a huge health pool. You'd rather revive, you know, your one big minion that survived for a lot longer and is probably reviving for a larger amount of health. So if I'm using revive, I'm probably putting it on a build where I only have 1 or 2 minions and they're both very strong. I wouldn't combine it with the minion based build where I'm playing 5 or 6 of the weaker minions that I have to buff up, because the buffs are not going to carry over when you resurrect that minion. Okay, next up is Sanctuary. Prevent all damage of an ability that targets you. Gain the amount of health prevented in this manner. And this one, I think I'm going to throw in B tier. I used to think it was A tier because I'm like, oh, you can prevent burning, you can prevent poison, you can prevent hex, and then instead of losing all this health, you're going to gain it all. But what I realized later when no one was casting prevention, when I'd go hex crazy with my necromancer, was that I think Sanctuary only works for direct damage that would have hit you in one shot, like Fireball, which takes 30% of your health pool away. It's kind of a one-time use as opposed to something that counters a debuff. So if Sanctuary could say counter poison, and instead of losing 4% health brand, you were gaining 4%, I would rank it higher on the list. But because I believe it only works for one-time damage spells, there just aren't too many of those that are used in the game. And I think that means that the utility of Sanctuary greatly goes down. Next up, we have Silence. Force all players to check the current street. And this one I used to have in D tier, but I'm actually going to bump it up to C tier just because of the fact that it can combo well. One of the annoying things that can happen in Heroes of Hold'em is you have an ability that you really want to use, and then people keep betting and you don't get to make it to the action round of a street, and you don't get to cast your spell. By having Silence, you can prevent the other players from making any bets on that current street and, you know, greatly increase, now pretty much guarantee the chances that you get to cast your spell that you want for that street. You can also prevent players from putting in a big bet on a later street when the pot is really big. So this can be a good protective technique to use as well, not just for casting abilities, but also for trying to get to cheaper showdowns. Granted, this isn't going to work when you're all in, and since in the late game a lot of the pots are between short stack players and there is a lot of all in action, but I still think it's got some benefit and belongs in the C tier rather than the D tier. Next we have Smite. Force all minions not all in to fold and surrender 30% of their health to you. This one I am going to throw in D tier. The problem with this spell, if I read it correctly, because I don't really use this spell, is that you're forcing the minions not all in to fold, fine, and surrender their health. That's great. But if they didn't even play the pot, I don't think they're affected by this. So you need to get into a situation where all the minions have seen the flop with you, and then you get them to fold. So first off, you need to be at a table that has a lot of minions, and then you need to get past the flop without a lot of betting. Now, granted, that second part's going to happen fairly often because the minions generally aren't too aggressive. But to get on a table where you're going to get to pull this off, I just don't think happens that often. And this is exclusively an early game ability. For what we're talking about with this tier list, we want to focus on things that can help us in the mid game and the late game, not just the early game. Speaking of mid game and late game, one of the most S tier abilities, not just for the Cleric, but in the entire game, is going to be Tithe. Force all players to call the big blind, gain an amount of health equal to the pot. This thing is one of the most S tier things I've ever seen. If you're playing at a full table, you basically get 5 free big blinds. You post your big blind, everyone else has to post that big blind, and you take what's in the pot. Actually, if you add the antes in there, it's even bigger than 5 big blinds. And the power of Tithe is it scales as the blinds go up. If the big blind is 100K, you Tithe, you get about 500K. If the big blind's 1 million, you Tithe, you get 5 million chips. So this is extremely powerful for surviving late in events like the Horde or Flip for Your Life, where the blinds are very high and the average stack is very small. Because, you know, you're going to have a lot of players who have 2, 3, 4 big blinds for average stack, and you just cast this spell and you get a stack that's bigger than theirs. The other thing that's really nice about Tithe is the all-in protection element, that if you have less than the big blind and you cast this, you will be considered all in as far as the betting goes for the rest of the hand. But the chips that you gained from that gaining an amount of health equal to the pot are just yours to keep until the next hand. So you can kind of free roll that all-in situation and then have extra chips behind as well. This thing is beyond powerful. It's one of the reasons that I consider the Cleric one of, if not the most powerful characters in the game, and why Cleric is my favorite character to play. I mean, it's basically these S tier abilities. But Tithe is one that I will often use answered prayers to get back, especially if I'm playing in the Horde or a tournament where the blinds are really big and it's largely about survival, because picking up 5.5 big blinds for free buys you a lot of time, and the bigger the blinds, the even more impactful it is. Only thing to be careful about with Tithe is casting it when you're at a 3-handed table or a 4-handed table, because you're getting a smaller pot than you would if you're at a 6-handed table. So, you know, if I'm on the final table bubble, I kind of need it, but I might be able to survive. I tried to wait till I'm at the final table. So instead of tithing, you know, 3 people or 4 people, I can tithe all 6 and get the full value for the ability. Next up, we have Tower Defense. Pre-flop and big blind. Call any non-all-in raise without using your health. And this one, it's close. It's close between A and B, but in the interest of, it's a pretty good spell, and also I'm trying to keep the tier lists kind of balanced, so there's kind of an equal amount in each category. I'm going to throw this in the A tier. It obviously is situational that you are going to be in the big blind. The only time you can cast this is if you're in the big blind. But it's pretty powerful when that's the situation that you're in, because you can call any non-all-in raise without losing your health. You know, if someone raises 3x, you can see the flop for free. If someone raises 5x, you can see the flop for free. The one downside to this is it is kind of easy to play around if someone's paying attention, because they can just make sure they're going all in for the raises instead of going for slightly less. But, you know, often players are going to open for less than that, and this can just generate a lot of free chips. Generally, the abilities that generate a lot of free chips, like free straddle abilities or like Tithe, are going to be high-ranking skills, because the most beneficial things in Heroes of Hold'em you can do are get your abilities back, generate free chips from the ether, and recover your stack if you get stacked. Do some healing, because those are the things that both keep you in the game, increase your chances of winning the game, and make you a tougher opponent to play against. So for that reason, I am going to throw tower defense in A tier, but I will say it's kind of close. And finally, we have Virtue. Minions you control have health 1 in pots doubled for the next 12 hands. This one I'm going to throw in B tier because of the fact it is purely for a minion base build. It's basically like Hallowed Halls. You get the 12 hands with a 50% increase in health 1, but you don't get the benefit for your hero. You only get it for your minions. So when I'm doing a minion base build, I'll often have both of these abilities equipped to my hero and start the game out by casting Virtue and then immediately casting Hallowed Halls the next hand. Actually, what's great about Virtue is it's a pre-flop ability and you can cast it and Hallowed Halls on the same hand. So you can immediately start the game with your minions getting a 100% health boost from pots 1 and yourself getting a 50% health boost from pots 1. Now, I don't use this if I'm playing in a tougher lineup, but if I'm playing in the 2-man sit and goes or the 4-man sit and goes where there are some newer players and minions can really just carry you all the way till the end, then I love having these two spells. Especially because if you have both of these activated and you happen to get on a table with your own minions, you can just chip dump to them. You can, raise whatever, 90% of your chips, fold. You're going to get your full stack back from that hand. Well, no, if you have 50% leech, you'll actually want to go to showdown. If you raise to whatever, 9K out of your 10K, they go all in for another 1,000 and you fold. Now the pot's 18,000 from them calling your raise before putting the rest in. If you have 50% leech, you're going to get that 9K back, and then they're going to get an extra 18K because they have the 100% health bonus. So on the minion based builds that I do, which are angel heavy with increased leech where they have about 50% leech, this combo is just off the charts. If you get on the table with your own minions and you have a 50% leech, I mean, heck, even if you have 40%, it's gonna be pretty good. And you have these bonus buffs going, you can just print so many chips out of the ether for as long as these spells are active. And then, then you just have to hope that your minions don't donk their chips off because they're obviously not going to play as well as you would. But it can really enable you to get carried very, very, very far and then have a lot of chips to be able to leech off them for the pots that they play. It's also extremely beneficial when you're playing those small field tournaments if your minions end up at a table where it's just like the 3 of them or the 4 of them, and they're just playing pots against each other, because every time they play a pot, you're printing an extra 100% of chips out of the ether. And that really enables them to chip up without having to make any kind of great poker decisions. So that is going to wrap up my tier list for the Cleric abilities in Heroes of Hold'em. Maybe you agree with it. Maybe you think some things are different. Please feel free to let me know in the comments if you have differing opinions, why you have differing opinions, because I would love to learn from you just as much as I hope you enjoy learning from me. And I hope that this information helps you build better clerics, get more caches, and ultimately get more wins. Thank you so much for watching this video. This has been Evan Jarvis for Heroes of Hold'em, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the tables.